Russia has been on the offensive for nearly 2 years. It gained less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. So Ukraine has proven to be adaptable, resilient, and able to resist the Russian onslaught. So far, as far as Ukraine is concerned, there is no prospect for a strategic Russian breakthrough anywhere in the front lines. And as long as the flow of Western weapons continues, and President Trump has now agreed to supply weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine can keep resisting for years to come.
Talks between Vladimir Putin and the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff this afternoon have been very productive, according to Russian officials. Mr. Witkoff is in Moscow with just 2 days ahead of Donald Trump's deadline for a ceasefire in Ukraine. The US president has warned he'll introduce further sanctions and tariffs against Russia and its partners if it continues to bomb Ukraine. Mr. Trump claimed while campaigning that he'd end the war in Ukraine on day one, and he has become increasingly frustrated with his Russian counterpart's refusal to end the fighting. Let's talk to Yaroslav Trofimov, who is the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent. What do you think will actually come out of these talks? How do we interpret very productive?
Well, I mean, we already have an answer because about 8 minutes ago, the White House announced that it's imposing an additional 25% tariff on India related to the purchases of Russian oil. And India is buying about 40%, 38% to be more precise, of Russian oil exports. So I guess the talks in Moscow between the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Putin were not as constructive as Russia makes it out to be. It doesn't look like there was any breakthrough. Russia continues to refuse the ceasefire that Ukraine has accepted in this war. And so we're now seeing the first consequences of this. Let's see if there will be additional steps. But, 25% tariff on all Indian exports related to the Indian purchases of Russian oil is a very serious incentive for India to stop buying, or at least to dramatically reduce its purchases of Russian oil, which would be an important cost for the Russian economy and Russia's ability to prosecute the war.
Do you believe that that will be enough? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how little we really know about what is left in the war chest for Russia. We will never know, will we? And so trying to then work out what the leverage is on a tariff such as the one on India, I mean, it is difficult.
I think President Putin is determined to keep going with his campaign. His goals have not changed since the beginning of the war. We've seen it from the Russian proposals, the peace talks with Ukraine in Turkey a couple of months ago. His goal is the elimination of Ukraine as an independent state. And I think he believes that he can still achieve that. The Russian armies are advancing very slowly at tremendous cost in lives and treasure, but still slowly advancing in Ukraine. And I think the calculation in the Kremlin is that Russia can withstand these and other sanctions and eventually prevail.
But do you think that it can?
Well, so far, Russia has been on the offensive for nearly 2 years. It gained less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. So Ukraine has proven to be adaptable, resilient, and able to resist the Russian onslaught. So far, as far as Ukraine is concerned, there is no prospect for a strategic Russian breakthrough anywhere in the front lines. And as long as the flow of Western weapons continues, and President Trump has now agreed to supply weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine can keep resisting for years to come.
Where do you put the current relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump? There was, it wasn't a love-in, but it was definitely warmth between them at the start of Trump's term, but that changed. Slurs were bandied around that Putin was mad. He seemed to be playing Trump. Where are we today?
Well, President Trump thought that he could offer what he considered to be a reasonable deal to President Putin to end the war, which involved Ukraine ceding large parts of its territory and other very painful concessions by Kiev. But that wasn't enough. So President Putin refused that proposal. He refused the demand of an immediate ceasefire that Ukraine accepted. And I think President Trump now is upset. He's upset at his lack of ability to influence Putin, at the continuation of the killing in Ukraine. And he is trying to impose costs on Russia. Let's see how far he will go and what sort of costs for the U.S. he's ready to accept it, because obviously pressuring Russia economically will inevitably lead to a rise in the global prices of oil that will also have an impact on the American economy.
Do you think that there would ever come a time when there would be visible dissent in Russia because of the extreme poverty that some people live in, the extreme grief that some people have experienced, losing their young sons and brothers and husbands to this war? Is there ever that type of tipping point coming?
Well, never say never, obviously, but there are no signs of anything like that happening in Russia now. The Russian economy, all in all, is doing okay, considering the strains of the war. There seems to be no public dissent over the tremendous losses. Russia lost more than 1 million people in this war, soldiers killed and injured or maimed or missing. And the regime is become so totalitarian in its suppression of any form of public dissent that people just don't dare to criticize the war. Under the new legislation passed 3 years ago, discrediting the Russian armed forces in any form, involves very lengthy prison terms. And so people just keep quiet. And there is this safety valve for the regime because Russia allows those who are not happy with the war to leave the country. And hundreds of thousands of people have left the country since the war began.
Yep. I mean, it is really worth concentrating on our minds on that unbelievable loss of life sometimes, isn't it? That is just so many often young lives gone, and in Ukraine, so many lives lost. Donald Trump does well to keep referencing that, doesn't he? Do you think that I don't want to say does he genuinely care, but do you think that he spends a lot of time thinking about that personal loss of life?
Well, I'm not sure how much time he spends thinking about this, but he clearly keeps mentioning this quite often. And I think he watches TV a lot. He sees these scenes of destruction in cities like Kiev, and President Putin has in recent months really adopted the policy of deliberately targeting civilian population centers, especially in the Ukrainian capital, kind of a repeat of the Blitz of London, attempting to create panic and to create dissent. That's not working for him, but it is creating these scenes that are having an impact on American foreign policy, as we can see it with President Trump, who, really saw his relationship with Ukraine through the prism of his sometimes very difficult relationship with President Zelensky, but now seems to have a degree of empathy towards ordinary Ukrainians and as he watches their plight on television.
Can we just talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin? He is a man who needs to come out of every situation looking powerful, looking in control, and looking victorious to his people. Can you see that there is a way that he could ever be given an opportunity to retain some of that patina of victory, whilst at the same time giving the Ukrainian people what they want? Is there a way that you could ever make this man admit that he was wrong, retreat from the war, but allow him to still tell a story that he wants to tell?
Well, he's obviously never going to admit that he was wrong, but there are ways of ending this war for him that allow him to save face. And Ukraine has agreed to an unconditional ceasefire that would freeze the front line and allow Putin, at least for the foreseeable future, to keep about 18% of Ukrainian territory that he already controls. Russia refused that because Russia wants much more. And I think it's no longer an issue of Putin needing to save face or have legitimacy. He has legitimacy. The Russian state system is so strong, the suppression is so high, that there is no challenge to his authority. But he sees himself as a historical figure along the lines of Emperor Peter the Great, and he thinks that his mission in life is to regain the glory of the empire and reconquer lands that were foolishly lost under Gorbachev when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think that's what's driving him. He is a man on a mission. He sees himself as one of the greats of Russian history, and he doesn't mind the cost.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Yaroslav Trofimov, who is the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent.